May 9th, 1945. Moscow. The war is over. Red Square is filled with 2 million people. Soldiers are weeping. Strangers are embracing. After 4 years and 27 million Soviet dead, a number so large it still resists comprehension, the Soviet Union has survived something that should have destroyed it. Stalin stands above the crowd watching, and while the celebrations continue below, he is already thinking about the next war. Not because he wanted one, because he understood something that the celebrations obscured. The Soviet Union had won by absorbing casualties that would have collapsed any other nation on Earth. It had won through mass manpower, mass production, mass sacrifice. But the weapon that ended the war in the Pacific wasn't mass. It was a single bomb dropped from a single plane over Hiroshima, and America had it. The Soviet Union did not. From that moment, everything changed. The decision Stalin made in the summer of 1945 was not complicated. The Soviet Union would build the bomb, whatever it cost, whatever it required. The entire industrial capacity of a nation that had just survived the most devastating war in human history would be redirected toward a single goal, achieving military parity with the United States before the Americans decided to use their advantage. It took 4 years. The first Soviet nuclear test happened in 1949, years ahead of American predictions. The CIA was stunned. Western governments scrambled to reassess. And inside the Kremlin, the lesson was written in stone. When the Soviet system focused its full resources on a military objective, it could achieve the impossible. The problem was that achieving the impossible became the only thing the system knew how to do. By the early 1950s, the Soviet military budget was consuming resources at a rate that had no parallel in peacetime history. Not just nuclear weapons. Though the nuclear program alone employed hundreds of thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers in secret cities that didn't appear on any map. Conventional forces, too. The Red Army maintained over 5 million soldiers under arms throughout the 1950s. Tank production ran at levels that made Western manufacturers look amateur. Artillery, aircraft, submarines, everything produced in quantities driven not by strategic necessity, but by institutional momentum and ideological competition. The consumer economy was an afterthought. Literally, Soviet economic planning allocated resources through a hierarchy in which military production sat at the top and consumer goods sat at the bottom. A factory manager who failed to meet his military quota faced consequences. A factory manager who failed to produce enough refrigerators faced a reprimand and another quota. The incentive structure was perfectly designed to build weapons and perfectly designed to ensure Soviet citizens stood in lines for bread. Khrushchev understood this. He came to power after Stalin's death in 1953, genuinely believing the system could be reformed, that military spending could be rationalized, that resources could be redirected toward housing and food, and the things that made ordinary Soviet life bearable. He cut the army from 5 million to 3 million. He canceled some weapons programs. He tried. The military-industrial complex that Stalin had built didn't just resist these cuts. It had become the Soviet economy. The defense sector employed roughly a third of all Soviet industrial workers by the late 1950s. The scientists, the engineers, the factory managers, the party officials, whose careers were built on military production. This was not an interest group that could be simply overruled. It was the system. And then came Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. A metal sphere the size of a beach ball launched into orbit and began transmitting a radio signal that could be picked up by anyone on Earth. The Americans heard it. The world heard it. And the political shockwave it created in Washington was exactly what the Kremlin had intended. What Khrushchev understood, and what the Americans were slow to grasp, was that Sputnik wasn't really about space. It was a demonstration. The same rocket that put a satellite in orbit could put a nuclear warhead on New York. The Soviet Union had just announced, in the most public way imaginable, that the age of American invulnerability was over. The American response was predictable and catastrophic for Soviet finances. Congress panicked. Defense budgets exploded. NASA was created. the space race began. And the Soviet Union, which had just demonstrated its capability with Sputnik, now had to maintain that capability against an adversary whose economy was roughly 3 times larger. The arithmetic was brutal. America could spend 10% of its GDP on defense and still have the world's most prosperous consumer economy. The Soviet Union was already spending somewhere between 15 and 25%. The exact figure was classified even from most Soviet officials, and its citizens were standing in lines for meat. Every ruble spent on a missile was a ruble not spent on a hospital. Every engineer working in a secret weapons facility was an engineer not designing better tractors or more efficient factories. The Soviet economy was running a deficit that didn't appear on any balance sheet, a structural deficit of human capital and industrial capacity being permanently consumed by military production. Nobody in the Kremlin talked about this openly. The ideology didn't permit it. Socialism was supposed to be superior to capitalism. The Soviet system was supposed to deliver both guns and butter. Admitting that it could only deliver guns would have been ideologically catastrophic. So they didn't admit it. They kept building. By 1960, the Soviet Union had achieved something remarkable. It had created the second most powerful military force in human history, capable of destroying the United States multiple times over, while simultaneously creating an economy that couldn't reliably stock its own grocery shelves. The empire was at its most powerful, and the mechanism that would destroy it was already running. January 1981, Washington, D.C. A tall, silver-haired former lawyer named William Casey walked into CIA headquarters as the new director and immediately asked for every piece of economic intelligence the agency had on the Soviet Union. Not military intelligence, economic. What he read confirmed something he had suspected for years. The Soviet Union wasn't just an ideological enemy. It was a financial patient in critical condition, kept alive by oil revenues, propped up by military momentum, and fundamentally unable to sustain the competition it had locked itself into. Casey brought one question to Ronald Reagan. What if instead of matching the Soviets militarily, which America had been doing expensively for 30 years, you simply made the competition more expensive than they could afford? Reagan understood immediately. He had been making this argument for years and nobody had listened. Now someone was offering him a plan. The plan had 3 components and each one targeted a different Soviet vulnerability simultaneously. The first was Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had invaded in 1979 and was already bleeding, not catastrophically, but steadily. Casey dramatically escalated American support for the Mujahideen resistance fighters. Not enough to defeat the Soviets, enough to make sure they could never win. Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. Training, logistics, intelligence. The goal was not Afghan freedom. The goal was to turn Afghanistan into the Soviet Vietnam, a war that consumed money, equipment, and morale with no possible victory. The operation cost America approximately $3 billion over a decade. It cost the Soviet Union somewhere between $50 billion and $100 billion and tens of thousands of soldiers, in a war that ended with nothing gained and everything spent. The second component was oil. The Soviet Union, by 1980, was earning roughly $32 billion annually from oil exports, hard currency that was keeping the entire system functioning. Without those dollars, the Soviets couldn't import the Western grain. Their agricultural system couldn't produce, couldn't service their foreign debt, couldn't maintain the facade of economic competence. Casey flew to Saudi Arabia. The conversation that followed was never officially documented. What happened next was that Saudi Arabia, which had been restricting production to keep prices high, dramatically increased output in 1985 and 1986. Oil prices collapsed from $30 per barrel to under $10. Soviet hard currency earnings were cut by more than half almost overnight. The third component was the simplest and most expensive. Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system that would theoretically make Soviet nuclear missiles obsolete. Whether SDI was technically feasible was almost irrelevant. The Soviets had to assume it might work, which meant they had to attempt to match it, which meant spending billions they didn't have on research programs their economy couldn't support. By 1985, the trap had fully closed. A new Soviet leader inherited an empire simultaneously bleeding in Afghanistan, hemorrhaging oil revenues, and facing a technological arms race that would require spending the system had no capacity to generate. He was young, intelligent, and genuinely believed the system could be reformed. He had no idea that the trap had been deliberately set, or that reform would make things worse before it made them better. Mikhail Gorbachev was 54 years old when he became General Secretary in March 1985. He was the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin. He smiled in public. His wife appeared beside him at official functions. He spoke without reading from prepared notes. In the context of Soviet leadership, this was revolutionary. But behind the charm offensive was a man reading numbers that terrified him. The real Soviet economic figures, not the falsified statistics published for public consumption, showed an empire spending itself to death. Military expenditure was consuming between 25 and 40% of actual GDP, depending on how honestly you counted. Oil revenues had just been cut in half. The Afghan war was entering its 6th year with no end visible, and the foreign debt that previous leaders had quietly accumulated to paper over the gaps was coming due. Gorbachev's diagnosis was correct. The system was broken. His solution, glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, was the most well-intentioned economic catastrophe in modern history. Here's the problem nobody in the Kremlin fully understood. The Soviet economy wasn't a normal economy that had been mismanaged. It was a different kind of organism entirely, one built around central planning, military priorities, and the complete absence of price signals. Every factory, every farm, every distribution network operated according to directives from above, not demand from below. It was inefficient, but it was stable in the way that a bicycle is stable, only while moving. Perestroika tried to introduce market elements into this organism. Private cooperatives were permitted. Some prices were partially liberalized. Enterprise managers were given limited autonomy. The intention was to make the system more efficient. What actually happened was that the bicycle stopped moving. The moment Soviet enterprises were given limited autonomy, they immediately did what any rational actor would do. They stopped producing goods that cost more to make than they could sell them for. The price controls that had kept basic goods affordable now existed alongside new market prices that reflected actual costs. The result was simultaneous shortages and inflation, empty shelves and rising prices, the worst of both systems rather than the best. By 1989, the economic situation was deteriorating faster than any reform could address. And then the wall fell. The collapse of Eastern European satellite states removed the final psychological foundation of Soviet imperial identity. These countries hadn't just been military buffer zones. They had been proof that the Soviet model worked, that socialism was expanding, that history was moving in the right direction. When Poles and Czechs and East Germans tore down the system with their bare hands, the ideological foundation crumbled faster than any economist had predicted. The final accounting came in 1991. The Soviet Union had spent approximately $300 billion in today's money fighting a Cold War. It had structurally no ability to win. The Afghan adventure alone cost more than the entire Marshall Plan that had rebuilt Western Europe. The military-industrial complex had consumed 3 generations of Soviet scientific talent, industrial capacity, and economic potential. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The most powerful military force in human history had not been defeated in battle. It had been bankrupted, slowly, deliberately, and in the end, completely. Casey's plan had worked.